Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry I cannot speak Spanish, but I can speak English very slowly. I have spent a long time thinking about economic development and how economic development worldwide for the past 200 years has created more and more cities, and that as a country evolves economically, it becomes more urban. And about 2 years ago, more than 50% of the world now lives in cities. I also note when we bring education to villages, like the picture on the screen, I know that those two children will leave the village because there is no higher education, there is no middle school. So if those children love learning or become passionate about learning, they have to leave the village. So if you look at this picture from either economic or learning point of view, you will have no villages. And so I've always wondered if there were other people who worried about that, and if maybe the digital world could, as I always imagined, bring to remote and rural places the kind of life, either economic, educational, medical, that previously was limited to cities. And I finally found a group, you. You're the first group I've met which is genuinely interested in how villages live and how you bring jobs back to them. And I find that absolutely fascinating. What I'm going to do for the time I have is try and share with you doing this globally and looking at the whole world, because very few people do that at the moment. One of the things about an economic crisis is we become more national. We become more local. And as the world sees more economic crises, the world becomes smaller, not bigger. So I'd like to see that change, and in my remarks I'll say some things that may offend people. Excuse me if I do, but you wouldn't have invited me if I was not controversial. Yesterday I was asked for the first time in many years about happiness. And again, this morning, it happened in a question with a charming reporter. And I decided I'd put happiness in the title because happiness is very different from pleasure. And happiness may not occur even though you have lots of pleasure in your life. So one thing I know, and I know with great confidence, is that happiness comes from meaningfulness. If you have a meaningful life, you have a happy life. And so I will share with you some trends, and excuse the word slides, there are not too many of them, but there is a trend at the moment to accept the concept of disruption, to accept an Arab Spring, to accept an Occupy, not because you agree with them, but because it is a disruption of one kind that everybody is seeing happening over and over again. And then there are other kinds of disruptions, technical ones, the ones we used to read about more than social disruptions. I meet many people who at the age of 50 or 60 look into the mirror and ask themselves, what meaning did my life have? And this can be very rich people. So it is not money. And it's also the case that history doesn't remember corporations. It doesn't remember technology as much as it remembers art. Not that art and technology are very different, in fact. So some of these are very important principles, and the power of open is well known, especially to this room, especially to the concept of open software. But the same people who advocate open software have iPhones, the most closed technology on the planet. And in some sense, you should be ashamed of yourselves, because being open is not being closed. And I knew Steve Jobs very well. We were very good friends, particularly in the 1980s. And he wanted to control. And that control, which results in wonderful design, is the exact opposite of open. And open, in the end, will prevail. And also, there will be a world without any kind of periphery. So for the entrepreneurs in the room, I think it's very important to forget some of the basic concepts that we're taught as children. Very many parents advise their children to go slowly, incrementally. Incrementalism is the enemy of good ideas. Incrementalism is the enemy of creativity. Now, some things may require incrementalism, but very few. Common sense, a bad idea. Common sense is common. And if somebody tells you to use common sense, ignore them. Because common sense will stop you from doing things that later become common sense. And I cannot tell you how many times in my life I've been told that something is a stupid idea, and then 5 years later, it's common sense. So try to ignore common sense, and remember that the best vision is peripheral vision. It's the vision of things happening on the side. It's the vision of movement. It's not the vision of acuity. It's not the vision of sharp detail. And simplicity, which is absolutely critical, is very complex to do. And when you fight to log in or to make a payment, you should complain. You should really not accept it. And the last remark there is very similar to the first, but reality is a way of escaping creativity. So let's be realistic. When somebody in the room tells me to be realistic, I suggest they get out of the room. Because if you're realistic, you're not going to be very creative. Now, connectivity, which is happening relatively naturally, it's happening wider and wider. Cell phone penetration is increasing. There are already today more handsets than there are people on the planet. And so we're getting a boost in connectivity. It should be a human right, and it ends isolation. Now, isolation of the kind I'm thinking is the isolation I see in Afghanistan, the isolation I see in African nations. It doesn't have to be that dramatic, but it's very important to end isolation, because isolation plus poverty is a very deadly cocktail, and it needs to be remedied simultaneously. I won't go through too much detail as my time is slightly shorter, but in the context of entrepreneurship and generating some of the ideas that I heard yesterday, they come from differences. If you have a homogeneous society, you have a much harder time generating new ideas. And when people look at the United States and say, you have a wonderful entrepreneurial society, they tend to ignore that one of the properties is a very heterogeneous environment. I remember writing for Wired magazine 15 years ago a story on why Europe was unwired. And my father was alive, a European in every way, spoke 8 or 9 languages, and he didn't like the story. I was visiting him, he was living at the time in Switzerland, and he said, I don't like that story. And I said, well, let's go through the points. And the first point was the absence of risk capital. And he said, no, there's lots of risk capital. I wasn't going to argue. We went on to the next point, and it was the centralist nature versus a decentralized society. And he said, no, and we went through all the points. And every one he said, no, that's not correct, until we got to the last point in the story. And this was literally the last point, said, and in Europe, they do not listen to their young. And he said to me, why should we? We both laughed, but it's a very big difference. And the young in the United States are taken much more seriously than they were taken in Europe 15 years ago. That has certainly changed. So when I talk about 1 laptop per child, or tablets, or connecting children, I think of a child like this one in Peru, where I am convinced that when she grows up, she will think differently, because her concentration, her involvement is very different than the kind of learning that comes from disciplinarian, rote teaching. Most learning in this world, sadly, is done by rote learning. You're asked to memorize things. That is truly a bad idea. But it's what everybody does. And then, what do? We test whether the child has remembered those things. Like what date a particular state joined a country, or what name of the author that wrote something. And this is not learning at all. And we need to escape from rote learning, even though 99% of learning worldwide is rote. So it's wrong. So I'm going to propose a couple of things in a few minutes that are an alternative, but they will all include rethinking childhood, rethinking the way children learn, and get rid of the concept of computer literacy. That is a stupid phrase. You don't need to be computer literate any more than you need to be a combustion engineer to drive an automobile. Computer literacy is a misguided concept. What you want children to do is to learn learning. To learn learning is very, very hard, and it's not something we think about. And we very often, we don't ask children to think about thinking, and to think about thinking about thinking. In other words, that the topic you're thinking about is thinking itself. And the closest we come is writing a computer program. When you ask a child to write a computer program, that child actually has to think about thinking. Because if the challenge is, let's say, to write a program that draws a circle, you have to express that in what's called an algorithm, and you write it in a computer language. And so when a child writes a program to draw a circle, that child is understanding circleness in a very different way. But then something even more interesting happens, and that is that the program doesn't work. Almost never will a program work the first time. So instead of a circle, something else appears on the screen. And what does the child do? The child looks at the screen, obviously knows that it's not a circle, but uses the evidence, whatever's on the screen, as a way to debug the program. And then changes and runs it again, and eventually there's a circle. And guess what? That child has experienced the closest you can get to learning. So here, in this particular photograph, and I'll show you many photographs this afternoon, this child is actually teaching, in this case his grandparents, how to read and write. When I started One Laptop Per Child, I didn't realize that this would be one of the most compelling examples, because in Peru, there are about 1 million laptops, a little bit less, and almost all of them are in remote villages, very remote villages, not in cities. And in those villages, we estimate 50%, maybe it's less, it doesn't matter, it can be as low as 25% of the children are teaching their parents how to read and write. And if that doesn't put goosebumps on your goosebumps, I don't have a better story to tell you. Because the role of those children is truly different than the role of attending school as we knew it in the disciplinary model. So learning, and debugging are key to One Laptop Per Child as a project. And when we started it, we asked ourselves, could we make this affordable? And it didn't just start a few years ago. Back in 1982, before the IBM PC was introduced, actually, we brought Apple II computers to 3 parts of the world: Pakistan, Colombia, and Senegal. This was in Senegal, in a village outside of Dakar, and the child in the picture does not speak French, does not speak English, and played the keyboard like a piano. And one of the things I'm asked constantly today about One Laptop Per Child is who will teach the children how to use the laptops? And when somebody asks that question, I wonder what planet they come from. There's not a person in this room who hasn't asked a child for help. There's not a person in this room, most of you are young, who wasn't asked when you were a child for help. So this child just used it. So we knew in 1982 that was not the problem, but it took until about 2001, almost 20 years, to deploy in a village that was truly remote and had no telecommunications, no electricity, no television, no nothing. And in this village in Cambodia, the average income at the time was $42 per year, not per month, per year. And these children took these laptops home, and you'll see a satellite dish in the back that was run by a generator, and with Wi-Fi they were connected to the internet. And when they brought the laptops home, the parents loved it. Because when you open, or the child opened the laptop, it was the brightest light source in the house. And I looked at the picture, literally the picture, and said to myself, is this scalable? Could you do this on a large scale? Because here, it was the tooth fairy. It was me. I had built the school, I had paid for the laptops, my son lived in the village, connected them, and it was a charming story, but it was one village. So the question was, what in that picture would not happen through normal market forces? Telecommunications would happen, electricity would happen, but I focused on the laptop. And the reason the laptop would happen is that there was no commercial interest in doing it. And when I wake up in the morning, I ask myself one question every morning, and that is, will normal market forces do what I'm doing today? And if the answer is yes, then stop. Because if normal market forces will do something, I don't need to do it. But normal market forces were not going to do this. Normal market forces were making processors faster and making software fatter. So every time you got more speed from Intel, Microsoft used more of it. And then Intel got a faster processor, and Microsoft made fatter software. And the net to us was zero. Response times went down, closing a laptop takes forever, initializing takes forever, and suddenly we found like a nuclear war that every time you did something, it was matched by obesity. And so everybody in 2001 was effectively driving an SUV that uses more fuel to move the car than the passenger. And so we asked ourselves, could we break that spell? Could we break the spell because we knew how? Could we break the spell because we had the credibility of MIT? And could we break the spell because I had spent so many years running the Media Lab, I knew many of the companies and many of the richest people in the world to help do it. So we set off to do it, and we started one laptop per child, which is so well documented now and highly criticized. I won't dwell too much on it except to show you some of the things that result from having been doing it for 5 years. And in the 5 years, we have found that teachers love it. Students in these countries sleep with their laptop. In Nigeria, and we had spent a lot of time designing the handle, which, needless to say, this girl isn't using. But in Nigeria, we found children, when their laptops broke, they didn't want to give them back to be repaired, because they felt that if they gave it back to be repaired, they might never see it again. And that having a broken laptop was better than no laptop at all, which is certainly not true. But what we discovered is you just go with a spare laptop, and you give them the spare laptop, and once they have their hand on it, they will give you back the other laptop. That's how they feel about them. And so in remote parts of Australia, Peru, India, we discovered, as I said a moment ago, the teachers truly behave differently. This teacher had always taught children in perfectly straight rows, perfectly still, who didn't want to ask a question. And the reason they didn't want to ask a question is they didn't want to be wrong. And this teacher, like many other teachers, punished students for being wrong. As soon as the laptops came, this is the way he teaches. And when I met him, I actually met this teacher, he said, "I can't believe it." He had never seen a computer. He had never taught this way. And the children run to school. The parents hang in over the windows. Discipline problems have gone way down. And the only complaint we have is from this man's wife, who never sees him. He's always at school. He's on school on Saturdays, in school on Sundays. He's school late, school early. The children are there early, late, Saturdays, Sundays. So it's just a different level of energy. It's a different passion that is really what education is about. And when I hear the marketing departments of some of the big corporations talk about education, it's usually about traditional testing, classroom, rote learning. And then we have organizations like the World Bank, the African Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank. And what do? They send their people out to measure. And what are they measuring? How well the kids do on test scores. That is even more stupid. But everybody's a supplicant. Everybody's depending on those banks to help them. We have over 2.5 million laptops in the field. And do you know how many were funded by the World Bank? 0. How many were funded by the US government? 0. How many were funded by the Inter-American Development Bank? 3,000. So what's wrong with these people? They are allergic to a new view on learning, that learning is about passion, that learning is about learning to learn. And they're stuck in this old rote learning, which is an industrialized process of producing kids the way we produce cars. So our partner, I have guaranteed myself no funding from the World Bank, but thank you for the applause. We did have one miraculous partner, and it was Kofi Annan. Not the United Nations as a whole, but he as an individual. And when we announced the laptop in Tunis in November of 2005, he sent me his speech by email. And I was asked to edit the speech. And I sent back a one-line message to his office and to him that simply said, "Do not change one word." It was so perfect. And because he was Kofi Annan, there were lots of press, lots of cameras, lots of television, very similar to as when your president arrived, you get lots of press. He did the same thing. And what we showed at the time was this. It was a working engineering model, and the picture went all over the world in November 2005. And everybody who saw the picture remembered one thing about it. One thing and only one thing. They remembered the yellow crank. Everybody. Even today, when I show somebody a laptop, they say, "Where's the crank?" We have lots of cranks, but we didn't put it on the machine because it turns out that's a stupid solution. You want it separate, like an AC adapter that kids can share. One of the things this laptop did, which was very important, is it converted into a book. And the reason I say that is you will see that the book theme evolves, at least in our world. It gets more and more dominant. And it's really important because in the next 5 years, there will be about 1 billion new readers in this world. Children who learn how to read, mostly that's where the number will come from. And if you have 1 billion new readers, you can't ship them physical books. It just doesn't work, especially when they're not in cities and they're in remote locations. So this aspect of it was really quite important. This is less so, but I will show, for those of you who haven't seen it, what we finally delivered as the laptop, and of course it turns into a book and a games machine. It does something else that everybody smiles when these little ears come up. Those little ears are not just Wi-Fi. They are a very early mesh network so that the children in the village could speak to each other by relaying messages. And in fact, there's a very sophisticated processor in there that when the machine is closed, it's still running, so that each laptop is a router until it starts to get down to 20% of its memory, whereupon it turns itself off so that the child doesn't wake up in the morning to find no battery. So that's what we built, and that's what we shipped. And the first country to do every child was Uruguay. Now, I never aspired to be on a postage stamp, but when the laptop was issued as an Uruguayan postage stamp, I realized that we had arrived in a certain way. The president of Uruguay said unequivocally, "My legacy will be 1 laptop per child." And he said to the people of Uruguay, every child will have a connected laptop in 18 months. Now, when you say that, a child who doesn't get it first is not so anxious because you'll get it soon. And you could roll them out in a very orderly way. And in less than 18 months, he did all the children. It's a little bit less than 500,000 children. When the teachers heard about this, one teacher in particular in this classroom, she had been teaching for 30 years. And she heard her president say that every child would get a connected laptop. And she said to herself, I'm too old for this. So she went to the Social Security office and asked for early retirement. They said, "Come back in 6 weeks," which is how long it takes to process. And during that interval, the laptops arrived in her classroom. And after 2 days, she saw the difference. and went running back to the Social Security office and said, no, 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 I want late retirement. And she is still to this day teaching. And she had an experience where she assigned to the children a project to do with cows. Laptop has a camera on it. One child went home. Her father said, "Oh, you're very lucky, because our cow is giving birth tonight." So the child stayed up, made a video of the birth of the cow, and brought it in. She had all the other students fascinated by her project, and as a group, they learned how to upload it to YouTube. Not download, but upload. And when they uploaded to YouTube, they got 100,000 hits. And as the teacher said, she never imagined that an assignment she gave would get 100,000 hits. The child who did it, it transformed that child. The child was not in any way the best in the class, but she became suddenly much more passionate about learning. And it's those stories that make me realize how important it is, in spite of some of the criticism, which I'll talk about in a moment. I'm going to go through these very quickly. These all happen to be Uruguay. Many of the kids go to school on a horse. These are kids that some tourist found. So there are just lots of examples, but I'm going to skip, because I'm a little short on time, to sort of much more recent work that looks at the next generation. This is a little over maybe 2.5 years, 3 years old. We started looking at other ways to do this from a technology point of view, and then finally went to the tablet about 2 years ago. About 6 months before the iPad, we introduced these images. And we were determined to build this, which was too hard, it turned out, technically, so we built this. This is what we announced 3 days ago. It got a lot of attention in the press over the last few days, and it's a very, very simple concept. No holes in it. Drop it from 20 meters. Takes less than 1 watt, very, very low power, and has in it a solar panel. So when you lift the cover, you generate power to run the laptop. And that's very important. And this is, at the moment, ready to go, and it's very, very, it seems to be a lot of demand. Now, what we're doing, I'll go back to this picture, what we're doing is a new project, which is an experiment. It's a small project. When I say small, if we look at 1 laptop per child over the past 5 years, it has spent about $1 billion. That's a very big project. And that counts the purchase of the laptops and the teams in the field and so on. The next project is a $3 million project. It's a much smaller project. And it's a simple question. And the question is, can children learn how to read on their own? Now, this may have been mentioned in the introduction. I wasn't able to listen to the introduction, but if children can learn how to read on their own, if you can learn to read, you can read to learn. And that's a very important change, because 100 million children do not go to first grade. And they do not go to first grade because there isn't one. Some of them are maybe in the fields because their parents want their help, but most of those 100 million children are just not near a school or near enough to a school. So what we're doing, and it is simply to take any tablet, be this one or another tablet, and bring it into the villages that are 100% illiterate. And the first ones went in 2 days ago to villages that have more than 10 but less than 20 children, and that have no adults who can read and write. Eventually, they'll be dropped out of helicopters, which is more of an image that suggests no human intervention. At the moment, they're brought in by trusted, maybe medical dispensary or people who are trusted by the locals, and they're given to the children. And they're loaded with movies, books, games. And the question is, after, let's say, a year or a year and a half, will the children be able to read? And at the moment, it's in English. In many countries in first grade teach the children to read and write English. Sierra Leone, Liberia, Papua New Guinea, Guyana. So many developing countries use English already, so it's not quite as imperialistic as it sounds. And if the children can read, then I think the world banks of this world will pay attention. So I want to leave you with 3 rather general concepts. And then I have to sadly run off to an airplane. And I put these together this morning as I was thinking about what I heard yesterday, what I saw actually this morning as well. And never argue against indoor plumbing. And why do I say that? There were people who argued against indoor plumbing very violently, and they said it will destroy the fabric of the village because the women, when they go to the well, that is their opportunity to socialize. And if they don't have to go to the well, they won't, and the social structure of the village will fall apart. You know that's not true. I know that's not true. But all of us accidentally, at times, argue against indoor plumbing accidentally. People tell me that social networks are going to destroy face-to-face communication. We know that's not true. The second thing is that the world in general, business, our lives, has really been like a fried egg. Your parents, certainly your grandparents, lived a fried egg life. And by that I mean the yellow was distinct and the white was distinct. There was a sharp edge between them. You went to work, and then you left work to go home and be with your family. And that was like the yolk and the white. You played, that was, let's say, the white. And you worked, and that was the yolk. You can see in many areas crisp boundaries, whereas life has become an omelet, much more intermixed. And just recognize it, enjoy it, take advantage of it, because we're all living an omelet life to one degree or another. And then as a last and closing remark, for those of you involved in computers and learning, whether it's children or adults, is always remember the difference between learning and teaching. Teaching is just one way to have learning happen. And there are many, many others, and I hope you engage with them. I hope you use computers in many, many different ways to see learning in the world go up. Because when that happens, there will be far more peace, far better environment, far better health. Thank you very much.